Hello everyone and welcome back to Rolling Through Negotiations. This is episode 106. We're recording it in October 2025. I'm Matthew Karakalakis. I'm the host of Rolling Through Negotiations. I'm a lawyer working in commercial and dispute resolution laws. I'm also an accredited mediator. I'm a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm an Aboriginal and Greek man, and I know firsthand what it's like to navigate high-pressure negotiations. It's exactly what we explore here on this podcast. Petina Tieman, she is an amazing Aboriginal woman, works on business strategy, she does facilitation, she's a consultant to government, she's done a great heap of work when it comes to leadership development. She's also an Amazon #1 best-selling author. And in this particular episode, we speak about how to understand, listen, and to be able to achieve cultural outcomes in projects, in negotiations. Petina shares with us in this episode some of the complexities, some of the ways she went about negotiating for a land use agreement that was backed by NASA for First Nations peoples. Petina touches on cultural elements to negotiations, positioning in negotiations, and much, much more. So I'm really excited to bring you this episode. I think you're going to get a ton out of it. And before we jump in, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of these lands that we're on. Let's pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Let's roll. Petina, sister, welcome to Rolling Through Negotiations podcast.
Thanks, Matthew. Glad to be part of it today.
When we think about Aboriginal business, you're someone that's been around for a while. And what I would love to be able to share with those people that are listening right now with us in this episode is a little bit about your lessons, your learnings, so that listeners can be empowered through some of the business journey that you've experienced. Because I think that one of the most beautiful parts about Aboriginal business is sharing the knowledge, sharing our experience and becoming empowered together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of that for me has been really analysing and identifying the differences between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses across the nation. So, and how they are perceived by industry and government in different locations as well. So for the work that we do with a lot of regional and remote businesses, it's very much around that education piece to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander business, but also to government and industry to help them understand that businesses in remote and regional areas are very, very different to those in metro and urban. So a lot of the clients that we work with in regional and remote areas of Australia, PNG, Torres Strait, if they're over the age of 30, they haven't been to high school or they haven't completed high school in regional and remote areas. Whereas in urban and metro areas, they are surrounded by education, they're surrounded by business acumen, they're surrounded by opportunities and access to resources and knowledge. So it's really clearly understanding each individual Aboriginal business owner for who they are and what their particular background and experiences are. Then how can we help to address those gaps? And then how can we help to advocate or support that person in that connection to government or industry or other stakeholder opportunities for JV and collaboration, etc.
And so when you're working with different Aboriginal groups throughout rural and metropolitan areas, in those sectors, for example, in various industry sectors with government, with education, what are some of the negotiation strategies that you fall back on to achieve really good outcomes for mob in the work that you do?
So a big part of it is, again, coming back to understanding first and foremost the level of comprehension, education, understanding that particular group has first and foremost, then to be able to identify what gaps do we need to address. Because if we can bring their knowledge and expertise and comprehension up to a level that they can then make informed decisions with those stakeholders. So an example of that is a monumental land use agreement that we've been able to facilitate with an external stakeholder backed by NASA. So the negotiations went on for 6 years with multiple traditional owner groups. And it was actually the TOs that said, we need you to engage Petina in her business because we're going nowhere over 6 years. Within 3 weeks of coming in and facilitating some workshops and some real high-level stakeholder negotiations, but at grassroots level, from the traditional owner's perspective, we were able to get a monumental land use agreement signed for the initial first 2 years of testing of the land for environmental purposes, for suitability for a rocket launch pad. And that was fundamental, and that, you know, with NASA has been huge, but for the traditional owner groups, this is opportunities for not just a couple of $1 million of royalties, but for economic development opportunities that they can work towards with the individual enterprise arms. But the initial stakeholders came to us and said, we just want you to get them to sign a land use agreement. And we said, no, we will not do that. We firstly need to ensure that the traditional owners understand the implications of this project, the enormity of the parcel of land you're talking about. When you put an aerial map up and show us that little matchbox looking size thing on an aerial map, what does that look like? And I said, you know, for example, is that the size of Cairns Domestic or Cairns International Airport? And he said it's the size of both the buildings. And the traditional owners were like, oh, wow, we had no idea, you know. And it's just really analysing and assessing what is their knowledge, what is their education level, are they fully aware of the implications, inferences, consequences, opportunities, to then be empowered to make the right decisions. And that's critical for everything we do with all the government contracts that we deliver every year. Is first and foremost, we need to work at the forefront with the traditional owners and the Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people to make sure that we understand where they're coming from, and then we can build something that's going to work for them, not how everybody else wants it to work for them. How's it going to work for them based on their lack of access to resources and equipment and people and money and whatever their family commitments are and their cultural commitments and things like that. So it's that individually one-to-one tailored approach.
Yeah, and what's the real challenge here when you're leading a project where there's such complex issues, and there's even in large-scale projects that have taken 6 years or more to get over the line, there's always time pressures throughout that project and through the negotiation process. So what are some of the real challenges that you experience when leading such a diverse negotiation project?
One of the biggest ones for us is the cultural governance versus corporate governance, white man law versus black man law. And, you know, what we find is that the non-Indigenous stakeholders will typically go, well, if we document it on a legally binding agreement, then they have to comply. And they've agreed to do so. And it's kind of like, that's not the way cultural governance works. The cultural politics and sensitivities come into things, and we need to make sure that through the education piece, we can mitigate those risks well ahead of time, and we can put some structure in place to support all parties to prevent things falling apart. You know, and it does come down to not just the governance side of things, but also, as you said, Matthew, the time restraints, understanding that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people work on different timeframes to a lot of the non-Indigenous stakeholders or government-funded projects and things like that. So it's getting that buy-in from all of those stakeholders throughout the entire process and keeping the communication channels open. You know, I had a government stakeholder contact me yesterday and say, how is this particular project going? Because the end date was 1st of October. And I said, yeah, but for the past 8 years, the 30 to 50 contracts that we deliver on that every single year, that's an indicative timeline only, because we need to take into consideration that there are a lot of cultural considerations that come up, whether it's family commitments, cultural events, business, etc., that will often derail our Indigenous clients. So we then need to give them that additional emotional support whilst having that business focus to it, to say, okay, we know that you need some time to go through your sorry business journey and your commitments around that. Let's pick the pieces up again in another few weeks and get you back on track.
So there's a lot of cultural intelligence that's required to understand and appreciate sorry business, people's ability to negotiate through such times. And I think that it could also be a challenge for some people in government that don't have these sorts of cultural appreciations to be able to understand the cultural elements so that the negotiations and project can stay on foot. How do you navigate through those kinds of places in leadership when you need to be that conduit of communication?
Yeah, an example of that was a recent national Indigenous mentoring program that we rolled out with a mining company, and it was to support their Indigenous workforce. And the challenge was that in the mining industry, they work on FIFO shifts and things like that. However, when we have sorry business, as it is, the Indigenous workforce are already feeling quite ostracised because they're often only one particular Indigenous person per team. And so they're not feeling that peer support. And when they have cultural activities or events that they need, like sorry business, their supervisors, team leaders, their employers aren't necessarily supportive or understanding of sorry business requirements, and then the impacts that that has. So each person within the family around sorry business has certain cultural commitments that they must deliver on. And an example of that was a particular Torres Strait Islander person working within a mine. Family member had passed. That person didn't take time off work because she couldn't seem to get the supervisor to understand the cultural requirements. And when she went back home the week after, her family shunned her. And, it was very difficult for her to then be within the family environment during that already difficult time of sorry business, because from the family perspective, she put the work priorities first. And in her mind, it was, why should it be my job to educate my supervisors and team leaders and my employers? And I said, well, it has to start somewhere, because if you working for that organization are not prepared to step up and help them understand and educate them, how are they ever going to have open-minded changing policy and process and giving some, cultural leave and things like that to, be able to better support you as an employee? So it is that conduit piece where we're working, yes, with the Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples, but we're also working with government, industry, mining sector, etc., to better understand all parties. And another example of that is we've had so many different government projects where they're not understanding that in a remote community, we might have 8 adults, 6 children, all living in a 2-bedroom home. And we think of that as overcrowding. What we're not thinking of is it's not just overcrowding. In a tiny home, you have a tiny fridge. How is a tiny fridge going to accommodate the food for a house of 13 or 14 people? Which then means they can't go to a supermarket to do a weekly grocery shop because they don't have enough space to accommodate their food. Instead, they're doing daily shop or every second day, which then means it's an increase in their spend, which is reducing the available cash flow that they have in the household for all their other living expenses. And it's just a case of creating that education and awareness that, hang on, if we're going to be doing these projects, that are labelled as First Nations, and we want Indigenous or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be engaged in community and stakeholder consultation, then we really need to understand from their perspective what they need, who they are, what their barriers and challenges are that are far beyond the internet. It's
Yes.
not just we don't have connectivity.
So when you were speaking about the employee situation earlier, if an employee has a proper intention of wanting to share some cultural considerations within the workplace, but the management structure isn't open to listening and learning, then that intention for sharing goes nowhere. And so as part of that conduit that you're speaking of, there needs to be respect, there needs to be care, there needs to be a great appreciation through adversity for those communication channels to lead to productive outcomes.
And an example of that is some of the projects that we do in regional and remote areas, but it's also in metro, not so much. But there's an expectation when you deliver mentoring and business support services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses that if the government-funded program can't afford for me to travel to do face-to-face delivery with that client, then we've got to do Zoom or Teams. But the reality is that most of our Indigenous people have prepaid phone or prepaid data or typically Wi-Fi that they're leveraging off somewhere else in the community, which means they don't have the affordability to do a 1-hour Zoom session to help them develop the business skills that they need to run a little micro business. So when we're delivering projects for mentoring and business support, let's then budget to pay for some data to engage that person in those fortnightly or monthly sessions, which is what we do and how we do things. There's a lot of government-funded programs that deliver group activities. So we want to build skills and capacity around financial literacy or around business skills and things like that. And let's do it as a group workshop. But most of our mob, they don't want to be in a group workshop environment because it's Shane's job then to ask questions. What they want is one-to-one support so that they can tell you exactly what their challenges, what their barriers are, what their educational acumen or access to resources, time commitments, all of those things are. And you provide that support one-to-one instead of group activity. So the programs that we have initially are, let's do a funded program that is a group workshop delivery, and then we immediately go, no, we already know that's not going to work. We're going to run a group workshop at the start, just like an info session, and then we will do one-to-one support. We'll fly into a community, and then we do 3 days of back-to-back one-to-one meetings, to better support the people, and that has a much stronger engagement. So again, it's creating that education and awareness piece to all parties that our mob want to learn, they want to build their skills and capacity, they want to work towards economic development opportunities, but we need to build the right types of programs, the right types of support that are going to meet their particular needs, not expect them to try and fit to the square hole.
Absolutely. And I think that it's really interesting when we speak about these principles of diversity, because part of what you're speaking about here is being non-judgmental, not thinking that other people from different backgrounds, specifically here mob, are going to have the same living circumstances as somebody working in one of the corporate offices, for example, or somebody working in a more metropolitan type structure. And I think that these sorts of situations in isolation can be seen very differently as opposed to real time. And I'm trying to shed some light and some appreciation and awareness around non-Aboriginal people that might be making these kinds of judgments and seeing if there's any pathways in which to remain open. And where I'm coming from, this is, just as an example, people, we make judgments all the time, right? So we make assumptions. Or other things is like this. We have what's known as a reticular activation system within our body that helps us to discern situations, because in each and every single moment, there's probably millions of different stimuli. There's different colours in the room, sounds in the room, vibrations in the room, things going by. You can be in busy areas, or even on country, there can be heaps of little insects flying around everywhere that you don't even see because your focus is somewhere else, right? That's how the mozzies bite you without you noticing. But through our reticular activation system, we learn to focus on certain things, to make judgments on others, and we need to be able to do this to be able to function in the world, right? So there's this side of things. The other side of things is the sensitivity, the appreciation for diversity. But where is it safe for non-Aboriginal people to be able to ask the questions? And where is the safety for an Aboriginal person being able to accept one of these kinds of questions so that we can navigate the pathway of unity?
You know, and I'm totally getting what you're putting down here. I'm all about the RAS, by the way. But you know, an example of that is I regularly have people say to me, "Oh, didn't realise you're Aboriginal," or "What percentage of you is Aboriginal?" And I respond to that by saying, if you see an Asian person, do you ask them what percentage of Asian are they? Or do you make an assumption that because they have, you know, skin of a particular color and a face of a particular shape and their eyes are, you know, slanty or whatever, do you go, you're Asian? That's an assumption. And you don't question what percentage are there. You know, it comes down to, as you said, what is safe? I have quite a few Indigenous clients that we work with who feel very ashamed, and I've had to go through and prove my Aboriginality because I am fair skinned and I have blue eyes and all the rest of it. But we have many Indigenous clients who, like me, are fair skinned, who, like me, have unfortunately, due to family circumstances, disconnected from family, and they are feeling completely lost, and they don't feel safe to be able to or know who to ask the right questions to get that validation, to get that acceptance. You know, it's quite a difficult situation. Another example of that is here in Queensland, in regional and remote areas, especially in North Queensland. Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people typically do not connect with the label First Nations. It's quite contentious up there, right? So Aboriginal people say, well, we are the first people here. We've been here 65,000 years. Torres Strait Islander people migrated from Saibai some 30,000 years ago, right? So in North Queensland, Aboriginal people don't connect with First Nations because it's putting everybody in the same bucket. And they're saying, well, Torres Strait Islander people are not the first people here. Torres Strait Islander people in North Queensland also are not connecting with that label First Nations. So when we did a really big whole of Queensland government project last year, we had to review and analyse 15 different strategic and policy documents across Queensland government. And one of our report with recommendations was at the very end, and there was a board attached to this particular project of heads of government. Two of those people were Indigenous, two of the board members were Indigenous peoples. And at the end I said, I need to make a recommendation, which is in our report, but I need to discuss it as part of this board meeting. And I said, it's very sensitive. And I said, the term First Nations is not connected with. Now, the reason that's important is government, you are complaining that you are not getting the engagement or the take-up in community consultation when you go into regional or remote areas for any project that's labelled First Nations. This is why, right? And the non-Indigenous head of that particular board turned around and said, I've never heard of that before. There's lots of government projects called First Nations. And I went, And he went straight to the other two directors that are on the board. There were 5 directors on this board, and he went straight to 2 of the other directors who were Indigenous peoples, very high levels of government. And he said, is that correct? And they said, yes, it is. And he said, why haven't you ever said anything? And they said, because we live and work in Metro. We know and accept that we can't do anything about this. We work within government. We have to work within the confines and the bureaucracy and the diplomacy of a role in government. Therefore, who are we to be raising this as an issue? And straight away the non-Indigenous head of the board turned around and said, that's it, we need to change these labels. If you want to understand why you're not getting engagement and why you're not hitting your targets and objectives of closing the gap and all of these other things, you need to then go out to the people and ask, why are they not connecting? Why are they not engaging? Consultation exhaustion is one thing, especially if they're not getting paid to do it, right? But at the same time, our people don't feel safe to say, no, we don't want to participate unless you're going to pay us. But as a consultant, I would say that, no, I will consult with you, I will do this, but it's going to come at a cost. Our mob in regional and remote and urban areas will participate in events, or they'll choose not to if they're not going to get paid.
Yes, I think what you say there is a very valid and powerful point, and spend into the long-term investment to create change. Because if somebody as an organisation is going about doing something just as a PR exercise, they're probably going to treat it a lot lighter than a true investment. And I think this is something that you're speaking about as well, Petina, in terms of this engagement and getting paid for this level of contribution. I think that it's not only about being valued for time, valued for knowledge, but it's also about a surety check to make sure that the contribution is truly valued.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also that acknowledgement that at the end of the day, there are subject matter experts. And if you're going to engage them to consult with you or to contribute content that you lack understanding or lack, IP or high-level content in, then you need to be prepared to put your money where the mouth is, right? So, I think our mob need to understand, and I see it all the time, Matthew, with clients that we help, especially in arts, culture, tourism, language, they undervalue their IP. And so a big part of the piece that we work on is helping Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to price their product or service correctly, not try and do it based as a hobby, not try and do it to compete with non-Indigenous people who are providing a similar product or service. No, at the end of the day, your IP is worth money. And even if it hasn't been protected by IP, trademark, copyright, etc., at this point, you still need to be pricing something that's worth a premium value, because otherwise the market undervalues the cultural knowledge and expertise that you're providing.
Yes.
Especially in our arts, culture, tour, language.
And a big part of this is about recognition. It's about boundary setting. I think pricing is about respect. It's about ensuring that whoever is going to receive the benefit of your knowledge, of your intellectual property, of cultural intellectual property, that they're going to properly appreciate the value that it truly is. Petina, at the end of every episode, I love asking guests if they have any points about negotiations that they would like to leave our listeners with. And so I was wondering in particular if you have a negotiation principle or strategy that you like to use that you might be able to share with us for our very own negotiations.
A big part of the work that we do is across any industry is procurement support. So helping businesses, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, position themselves correctly and suitably to win government contracts or work with tier ones, like your big John Hollands and Lend-Lease and all of those kind of, rail and all the rest of it. One of the things that, there's a lot of controversy around whether people should be connected to Supply Nation or Kinaway or this organisation or that organisation. What I can say is that as much as we need to consider our own ideas and values, what's really important is if you want to win those government contracts and those works with tier one, in particular around the negotiations, at this point in time, their requirements are those Black businesses need to be verified or validated on particular platforms like Supply Nation, Black Business Finder, Indigenous Business Directory, etc. If you're not connected with Supply Nation or all those directories, the fact that your business is a Black business because you say so on a website and because your skin might be a different color does not cut it for them to tick a box. So if you want to open negotiations to win those contracts, to get that procurement and, beat those non-Indigenous businesses, you need to question whether or not you're prepared to accept that you need to put your business forward on those platforms, on Supply Nation, etc. And we have helped multiple businesses, sole traders then convert to proprietary limited, win contracts from $350,000 to $1.5 million by simply listing them on those directories, because they are who the government and tier ones trust at this point to verify and validate that you are legitimately a majority owned and controlled Black business. So that would be the biggest negotiation tip that I would give at the moment, is don't just trust that because you say you're a Black business, don't just trust it's going to open the doors. It doesn't if you don't tick the box that they have to report on in their closing the gap targets or their RAP and their CSR targets.
Yeah, so I think what you're also speaking about here is positioning, understanding the target audience and making sure that you have, with integrity, especially when we're speaking about something like Aboriginal business, with integrity, setting yourself up to be positioned in the attractive way for the target audience as a place to be negotiating.
Yeah, absolutely. A big part of that, though, it's really important to understand that a big part of that is financial positioning. Most Indigenous businesses are happy to open the doors to JVing or collaborating with non-Indigenous businesses to win government contracts, etc. The biggest challenge with all of it is financial positioning. You can go for a tender, you can go for a government contract or a project with a tier one, but at the end of the day, if your business and its financials cannot demonstrate that you have the ability or capacity to carry the cost of labour, material, supplies of a project for 3 to 6 months and then get your milestone payment, which basically means most contracts are on a reimbursement model, the financial positioning for you is going to be a real struggle. And most tier ones and governments won't give you that feedback in writing. So the positioning is not just your marketability, it's the financial positioning to make sure that you had the capacity to carry the cost of projects for labour, material and supplies for 3 to 6 months, or that you can have access to that through an accountant or something like that.
That's beautiful, Petina, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom about positioning, but also your wisdom about Aboriginal business and everything that you've shared with us in this particular podcast. It's been great having you on the show.
Matt. Look, I've loved it. It's awesome.
Cool. And remember, we love you guys listening. We love you being part of the Rolling Through Negotiations community. So like this episode, share this episode, and please do subscribe to Rolling Through Negotiations podcast, whether you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, because when you subscribe, it helps us keep on bringing you fantastic episodes just like this one. Over and out now. Us.